Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Deepa Purushothaman. I'll tell you all about Deepa in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's so often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment that we exert for others. And when you do it as a leader, as you will find out that Deepa is, you do it to bring people together for common cause. So welcome, Deepa Purushothaman.
Thank you for having me.
Great. I want to tell everybody about you. Deepa is the co-founder of a company called nFormation, which provides, and I like this description, brave, safe, new space for professional women of color and women in public policy. Deepa is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School for Government, and she is a graduate of Wellesley as well, and the London School of Economics. So a lot. She worked for many years at Deloitte and has written for and been featured in Bloomberg Businessweek and Harvard Business Review, and is widely known on the conference circuit and has done many other wonderful things that have promoted the issue of that she's going to talk about today. Welcome, Deepa.
Thank you.
Great. So you say in your book, which I have a copy of, The First, the Few, and the Only, that this culture or corporate is not built for us or by us. What do you mean by that, Deepa?
So I'm talking about women of color, right? We were not in the seats designing how the structure was created. So in a lot of cases, the structure actually shows up differently for us. In the book, I tell a story where I sat down with Renee Myers, and she is the VP of Inclusion at Netflix. And as I was talking about inclusion, she brought up airplane design. And she said that when her children were younger, she used to really struggle when she traveled because she would worry about the luggage falling down from the overhead compartments. As soon as she told that story, I jumped in because I'm 5'1". And so the process of putting my luggage overhead is quite a process and something that I struggle with.
That's something my wife struggles with as well.
Yes. Okay. So you understand. And so It's interesting. I feel like I don't belong even before I get on the airplane, right? I'm worrying about it. I'm thinking about it. It's such an interesting situation. And so we were just talking as two women of color, like how our experiences and the things we worry about are different in this container or this context. And maybe, the taller gentleman sitting next to me isn't thinking about either of those issues. And so it's really talking about how workplaces and structures are really, reflective of who was sitting in the seats designing. And when I went back and did research around airplanes, most designers were men. And so there were only 2 or 3% of airplane designers back in the day when that was being designed that were actually women. So I do think height and maybe, thinking about being moms and thinking about the things that moms worry about, were just not part of the design. And I think the same thing is true of the workplace. And so it's an analogy that speaks to that.
I like your take on this because when I hear diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they're titled Women of Color, I think of skin color. I don't think anything else about, and you're talking about the real basic physicality, height. So, you don't get any more basic than that. So, what do we need to do about it? I mean, a million things, but you have a story, something called the Twofer. What does that mean? And how does that relate to change, Deepa?
So one of the stories I tell early on in the book is that I had just made partner in my firm. I was one of the first. I was feeling a lot of pressure around what was about to come. I was sitting down with a friend, who I thought was a really close friend. And we were toasting literally our promotions into the partnership. He had made partner in his law firm. And as we were toasting, I mentioned to him, I was feeling some concerns about what was coming next and the pressures. And he jumped in and said, as a woman of color, you're going to have nothing to worry about. You're a twofer. You check 2 boxes. And he was a white man. And so he said, but I'm going to have to worry. I'm going to have to work for what comes next. And it was a really fascinating conversation for me that stunned me in the moment, because as a woman of color, I wasn't expecting that or prepared for that. He was a good friend. And so it led me to believe if he's a good friend and thinking these things, like what are people who don't know me and don't know my history thinking? And I think it really speaks to how for women of color, we can be kind of going about our business and things are said to us or around us or actions are taken that really stun us and deeply make us feel like we don't belong, right? That there is a real questioning of our worthiness and being there.
Right. Well, and let me be devil's advocate just a second. So, and I understand the concept of we don't belong, but part of it might be simple ignorance on the part of also white males. Does that play into it as well, Deepa? So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's part of it, but I also think what I'm speaking about is the frequency with which that happens, and the fact that that was someone I had known for years and someone I'd gone to school with and someone who knew me well, and for him to feel comfortable saying something like that. And he said something like that many times, and we had, in future conversations unpacked it. He didn't really understand the gravity of what he was saying and how deeply it affected me. And I think if you sit down, and the book is really, I interviewed over 500 women of color in writing the book. It's story after story after story about what happens to us. And so I'm not talking about once a year someone says something. I'm talking about actions that happen almost on a daily, if not hourly basis. And I think there is a very different experience that happens for women of color that we need to talk about in workspaces.
Well, I'm glad you're raising the issue. I mean, it must also be, at least from my perspective, it would be from imagining what, because I have many friends who are different from myself, women of color. I know it's got to be tiresome, doesn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And the research that I found in meeting with all these women of color does suggest that it takes a toll on us. So 2 out of 3 women of color that I interviewed had what I call mysterious illnesses. And I think it comes from not being seen and heard in structures. I think it's really the weight of what is happening to us. And so we're talking a lot about being burnt out, but some of the research that we have done suggests that for women of color, there's an element of trauma and a real heaviness around the weight of, balancing all of these things that is very different and showing up very differently in our bodies.
Okay. So what did your research tell you about the physical trauma or experience? Because what did you learn from that?
Yeah, that it is showing up differently. So in the last few years, there has been more permission to talk about the fact that racism and things related to race happen at work. I think if you look back, 5 years, that conversation was a very different discussion.
Right.
As a result of being able to talk about it, or what I call permission, there's a lot more happening where women of color are actually feeling it in their body. So if you actually look at the science, what happens when you deny something happens versus once there is actually shared reality that something is happening to you, it actually shows up differently in how you process it and physically in your body. And so a lot of the women that I interviewed had things like skin rashes and, stomach pains, headaches, migraines, heart palpitations, adrenal fatigue. There's a long list of items that kept coming up over and over again as a result, I think, of finally acknowledging and seeing and witnessing and being, having permission to talk about the fact that racism is happening, in workspaces, and that the experience for them is really different.
And the symptoms you're describing is one would attribute to stress. Is
Correct.
that you? Okay.
They're all stress-related disorders, a lot of chronic illness, a lot of chronic fatigue, but all related to stress disorders.
Now, adding to that is something I think that you have experienced. It's being the first. And what is your experience, and how did you deal with that? So. Yeah,
I think sometimes when you're first, and it's interesting, it's a timely conversation, just because as I'm watching in between calls, the confirmation that's happening, there's a very different experience that I don't think we talk about enough for trailblazers or for firsts. My own experience was I felt very responsible, I think, for a lot of the women of color coming up around me. I felt like I was representing a lot of things beyond my own capabilities and when I sat in the seat. And so I think there is this real unique aspect to what we carry and the weight of what that means as we navigate these spaces. One of the women I interviewed was from the Midwest, and she's a Black woman. And she said when she joined her company, she knew she was going to be the only Black woman in her department. What she did not know at the time was that she's actually the only Black woman in her entire company. And what she shared as we were talking is she believes she's probably one of the only Black people in her entire town, or that whole city in which the company is in as a result of where it is. And as we were talking, she said, I feel really responsible. And I call it a very particular thing in the book. I call it representing your race. She said, I feel really responsible for representing my entire race with all my white colleagues, because I'm the only Black person that many of my white colleagues have ever met. And so I edit what I wear, what I talk about, what I eat, how I wear my hair. And she went through this long list and hadn't really realized the weight of what that was. Mm-hmm. Now, she's an accountant by training, so that is not at all what she was hired to do. This is, she's not a culture builder. That's not her role. And so I think sometimes what we don't understand or appreciate is that with a lot of firsts in companies or in spaces, there's a lot of things that are outside of the job that are become their responsibility, right? Another example is a lot of the women of color I interviewed end up mentoring very unusual numbers of other women of color or other women as a result of there being so few of them. So whereas maybe the white gentleman next to me may be mentoring 5 or 10 people or a dozen people, which feels reasonable and what you would do as a senior leader, some of the women of color I interviewed were literally mentoring actively 200 to 300 women of color because there was nobody else at that level or in that company to play that role. And so they're just things that happen that are, again, not the job we were hired to do, that you end up doing as a result of being one of the only, that I don't think we talk about enough.
Right. And then also, at least from my perspective, I think that when you are first and you are female and you are of color, I'll say you have to be better than anyone else. And is that a burden as well? So
yeah, I mean, most of the women of color that I interviewed, again, of all the 500, it was a constant theme. It's probably the one theme that I heard over and over again. So most of the Black women said they'd been taught early on they had to be 2 or 4 times as good as those around them and had to be perfect. A lot of the immigrant women that I interviewed were taught that they had to work harder and do more to even kind of be, taken fairly. And so there is this sense of overworking and overperforming. There's something in the book, that I didn't coin, but I think it's really commonly understood in these pockets, but that it's this idea of invisibility and visibility. In some ways, we are wholly invisible in who we are and our identity, right? Because we're asked to blend in and conform to the cultures around us. But in other ways, because we just physically look so different than those around us, we're also highly visible. And so a lot is asked of us and a lot of eyes are on us. So I think there is a very different level of pressure, a different level of perfectionism. I call it conforming, performing, and producing in the book. That really comes and is very acute for this group of this segment of the population.
I know the visibility quotient of this. What does it, and you did describe it, but let's probe this a bit. What does it mean to be invisible? Does it just mean blending in? But in a way, if you're the only person of color or one of 2 in a room of 30, obviously it's evident, so.
Yeah, I think it's visible, but I think what we don't talk about enough, especially in corporate spaces, but I'm realizing it's happening in all workspaces, is there are norms or things that we expect of people. So a lot of the women of color that were more senior that I spoke with said that they edited themselves or they erased parts of themselves as they rose. And they expected that once they got to a senior role, they would then do it their way, right? They would be more of themselves or bring more of their culture, their history. They might wear their hair differently. They might dress differently. One woman talked about how she didn't bring any art to the office because she didn't want to, highlight where she came from, as an example, but assumed like later in her career, she would do that. What we find is that is the part of the process that I really want to kind of open up and really talk about, because kind of erasing yourself, muting yourself is where a lot of us lose our power. And so when we say we're invisible or feel invisible, it's partly because we are not bringing those parts of ourselves or those parts of our identity, which are very important to the women I interviewed, to the workplace, because there's not real space to do that or to talk about that.
There's something else, and I've heard colleagues of mine, Black colleagues, speak about, and I'll use the word decompress. You go to work for however many hours and work a lot because these are highly successful people. Then you have to all of us decompress from work, but you have to kind of readjust. You adopt one persona in the workplace and another persona apart from it. Is that something that you see, Deepa?
Yeah, it's, in the book, I call it code switching, which is a pretty common term, right? So a lot of us will code switch what we say, what we talk about, the way in which we talk to fit into spaces. And in the book, when I'm explaining this to maybe some of the white leaders that I work with, I explain it as, do you remember when we used to travel more and we used to work overseas? And if you worked in another country with that you spoke a different language, and if you remember those days when you had to literally translate your business language into a different language. So I spent 5 years working in Latin America. And so when I had to conduct business in Spanish, it was a very different process. My brain was a lot more tired those days because it's an extra layer of translation and it's really hard work. And I remember going back to my hotel room and literally, needing to sleep. I was that exhausted. Yeah. I think what we don't understand is for a lot of women of color, a lot of people of color, that translation happens every day. Right. And so when I would speak with women of color and I would say, so like after hours, if you're asked to go to a party or to an event, a lot of women of color struggle with those extra few hours and having to code switch more because it's just a really heavy expectation, obligation that is also part of why I think we are stressed and feeling trauma in our bodies.
Dealing with the code switching, did you glean any how-to coping when people have to be, for example, on the road or at events and things? Did anyone share any techniques they have that might be of value to others? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of women that I interviewed are good at knowing what their limits are. So being able to do it in small pockets, really trying to limit the extra that comes in. Doing it for an hour and kind of exiting, knowing they're not going to stay for the dinner part of, they'll maybe stay for the drinks part of the conversation, right? Like finding ways to do it. Another one that a few women shared with me is they'll find, if they're not an only, but they're one of the few, they'll find a few other women of color or people of color to attend with them. And then at least that way they are not navigating spaces completely on their own. So I think there is really a lot to be said around navigating some of this and finding community. That's really what this work is about.
Okay. I think we've touched on this, but you do raise the issue of fitting in versus or leaning in. So what's the cost of that? So.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to that whole conforming idea. I think what we are finding is there's a lot of business books and a lot of advice that people give you to kind of work harder and do more and lean into the system, right? That's a lot of what has been said before. And I think what we are clear about is that doesn't really work for people of color and women of color. The more we lean into the system, there's a denial that the system itself does show up differently. And part of my work is really talking about the fact that I believe structures like corporate America are not a meritocracy. They do show up differently for different groups. And we've never really had permission to speak about that. And as a result of not speaking about that, I think a lot of us believe we are the problem and that we need to fix ourselves. So to go back to that airplane analogy, in those situations, I worry about not being tall enough. I worry about wearing the wrong shoes. I worry about all the things, like I pack too much. And I take it on me without realizing, like, they just designed different heights or done something to make that an easier process. That has less to do with my height and more with the design. So we're coming back to that idea again. So it is that sense.
That's part of the tragedy of, I think, of being a minority in a white dominated culture, is that it's the person who's in the minority begins to think, well, it's my responsibility to do this. All eyes are on me. And is there a sense of self-blame? I hate to say that word, but does that show up? So
yeah, I mean, a lot of the women of color, I think, get messages early on, and my work is really about unpacking what is really ours and how do you find power in what you believe for yourself versus what you've been taught. And a lot of the messages that we get end up in situations where a lot of the women of color I work with don't feel like they are enough. They have internalized that message from, the airplane analogies and all the things that have kind of signaled to them they are not leaders. They are not, vocal enough. They are not this enough. They are not that enough. And they've adjusted. And in adjusting, they have kind of lost parts of themselves. So this work is really about realizing that we are enough. And it maybe when we are not seen or we're not in full voice, it has less to do with our inabilities or our imposter syndrome and has more to do with the signals that we get and the confirmations and the reaffirmations we get from the outside.
Well, that's an interesting thing because you touched on leadership and I hadn't thought about it. If I look at a woman such as yourself, highly successful, and you started successful corporate career, and now in your entrepreneurial venture, all of those kinds of things. I would label you definitely as a leader. And some of the other people that I know that you write about in the book, I mean, that's leadership all over. So are you saying that, in my words, women are self-censoring themselves, so I can't be a leader? Do you see that, Deepa, or am I?
I think it takes a lot of active work to believe that you, again, belong and that you can show up, in leadership differently. I talk a lot in the book that we have adopted a very white male narrative of what leadership looks like. You don't see yourself represented, whether that's physically or whether that's in books, that in the messages that you get. And then when you end up in these corporate structures and you're told to be more assertive or more aggressive or all these be less emotional, like all these things, again, reinforce that leadership looks different than us. And so in order to believe that you can be that, you have to do a lot of reprogramming of those narratives. I tell a story in the book where I had an email early on in my career before I made partner that said, you don't have to see it to be it. Because most of us are taught that you have to see it if in order to believe you can be it. But what if you don't see it? I literally grew up with no example of myself on television, no example of myself in business, no example of myself anywhere outside of like the small pockets, of my mother's friends, right? Who most of them did not work. And so without those models, I think you don't actually have examples of what a business leader looks like. So it is active work. It can be done, but it's hard work. And it's different for us.
Absolutely. So you're talking about your generation. Is it changing with millennials or Gen Z? Is it because they're seeing you and people and your age group, even though compared to me, you're a very young woman. So is it changing? So.
Yeah, I spoke to women at all levels and all tenures. Again, I skewed a little bit more senior because I wanted to see what was happening at more tenured levels. But the younger women that I spoke with are struggling with some of the same challenges. I do think that they are coming into the workplace with a little bit more clarity on how it might be. Some of them are coming in with a different perspective on knowing they're only going to be in corporate spaces for a year or two. So it's a very much an extract mentality. I'm going to learn skills and then I'm going to get out. So even if the culture is toxic or doesn't work, it doesn't really matter because I won't be there long enough. Yeah. But I would say to you, a lot of the mid women, right? The women that are maybe 5 years plus, so still very, very young in comparison to me, are struggling with the same things. Those questions still came up. How much do I have to conform? How much do I have to edit? I don't feel like I have power. I mean, the biggest, I think, challenge that I find in the work that I do is so many of these very senior women don't feel powerful. And so what is happening that they are, John, to your point, you define them as leaders, but they don't feel powerful. That feels like a really big disconnect to me. And so I think those issues are still there even for less tenured women.
You have in your book, The First, the Few, and the Only, you have a wonderful section at the end. I'm going to call it my words because I try to do this in my books, a kind of a handbook. And it's, you call it The New Rules of Power. And just flipping through here, the power, quote, power over is over. So it's that authority in control. Power for good is stronger than power for self-gain. So what motivated you to do this little coda or handbook, in my words? So.
Yeah, part of what came up over and over again as I interviewed women was that when I would say, like, what do you think of power and what do you think of as powerful, I would get a lot of negative reactions. They would say things like power is actually bad. And a lot of women of color, interestingly enough, didn't aspire to power because they thought it was a negative thing. And I think a lot of that has to do with the messages, right? The books on power are all like Machiavellian, are all top down, are all assertive, are all aggressive. They're militaristic. And it didn't resonate with the women and the women of color I spoke with. And so the new model that I'm talking about is really what kept coming up over and over again. The women I met are ambitious. They do want power, but they want power if it's helpful, if it's a multiplier, if it's positive, if it's altruistic, if it's more than self-gain, if it's community oriented. So I wanted to show that we can remake power, we can remake leadership, we can redefine success. We don't have to accept the models that come before us, but we have to do some work to get there because, again, the things we are taught, I think, are flawed and need to be remade.
Okay. Now I'm going to put you in the spot here. So in your advisory role, and you're dealing with a company that wants to make positive change, and the person at the top is chiefly male, and let's say white and middle age. So what's the first step?
Yeah, I would tell you that I wrote the book for women of color. I've been really surprised at who has shown up. It's been a lot of male white leaders who've gotten early copies and delved in and reached out to me. I think there's a real desire to understand what is happening in spaces. I think there is a disconnect because some of them believe their employees will tell them what's going on, but it's still hard that we have not really created safe spaces in companies where that sort of transparency is widespread. And so I think part of what they need to do is find ways that they hear from outside sources like myself. I did 2 this morning already, just, and it's only 11:30 on the West Coast, talks with companies. And so I'm actually surprised by how many people want to have the discussion. I think there's an interest in changing it. I think a lot of white male leaders don't know what the work is, right? Or don't know what needs to be changed. They're open to the fact that something is not working, but please help me understand what that is.
Right. I've done programs on the wake for social justice in the wake of George Floyd. And has that been the heightening of the issue? Has that been beneficial to women of color in the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we would have had conversations like this prior to George Floyd's murder, right? I sold my book 6 weeks after his passing because there is a different conversation happening in workplaces. prior to his murder, I don't think you could talk about race at work. I think there was a feeling like it is a meritocracy. That doesn't happen here. That happens outside in the world, but it doesn't happen in corporate spaces.
Yeah.
I think we are having a completely different discussion, and there is more space and more openness. Do I think we're there? No, but I'm also optimistic that between the combination of his passing and the racial reckoning that has happened and COVID, which I think is making many of us ask, like, is work working for anybody? Those two issues coming together, I think, make this a moment where I do think we can remake workspaces and there's more openness to change.
You raised something issue when I asked you about the white middle-aged executives. How can folks like that make it safe to speak honestly about prejudice or negative aspects of being different or of color in the workplace? So.
Yeah, I think part of what we need to understand is it's not a one and done sort of conversation. You can't just hold a space and say, tell me how you feel, and then everyone's going to magically share, right? A lot of our HR processes are not set up to actually take in discrimination, or when people report racism, there's actually a lot of retribution and a lot of sidelining that happens. So I think culturally there's a lot of work to be done. So you have to understand it's a multi-year process. I think it's, you're going to have to hold space often. I think getting outside facilitators who can help look at the data and hold space is also really important. And I think a lot of, using books and tools like this one to actually engage in the conversation, have a conversation around the book so it doesn't feel so personal and exposing to people of color or women of color is also part of what can be done.
Here's the business equation. We are living in the area of great resignation, which I look at as the great liberation, because employees can be more self-determined. Is this a positive for women of color? So
yes, I mean, I think we're in a moment, and even though a lot of the book is very heavy, the overall message is we're in a moment where I think we are really stepping into new leadership. There's new possibility. There's new openness to remaking work. And I think women of color are well positioned because we have sometimes and oftentimes been in the group that is most disadvantaged to really talk about what needs to change, not only to help us, but to help everybody. So yes, I think it is a moment of opportunity if we can actually step into it in the right ways.
One of the concepts of advancing women in the workplace, or even diversity, is the concept of sponsorship. How can one be an active sponsor of women of color or different from us? So.
Yeah, I think we have to recognize that we oftentimes gravitate towards people who look like us. There's a lot of data in the book that, shows over and over again why that happens. So I think being really conscious of who you mentor and how you sponsor people that are different from you is really important, and being really thoughtful about it. We did research, my company, nFormation, we did research with Billie Jean King in the fall. And one of the pieces of data that we found, we interviewed white women in particular, is that 91% of them wanted to support or sponsor women of color, but only 9% were. And so there is a huge difference between, I think, intent and action. And I think everyone wants to do the right thing, but we need people to actually follow through with what that looks like in the workplace. And I think it's really being intentional.
So that's a key point, 90% versus 9%. What accounts for that great disparity, Deepa?
I think there's a lot there. I think people get busy. I think a lot of women are trying to hold on to their own seats. So, they want to help others, but they can't. I think there's the last couple of years have been really difficult. So I think there's a lot going on there. So I don't think it's for lack of intention, but I think we all just get busy and we end up in situations where we are focused on our own work. And we need to really step back and really figure out how do mentoring and sponsoring others, especially those who look differently than us, become part of our core responsibility. So it's everyone's work, not that just those few women of color that I mentioned who are doing 200 and 300, mentoring opportunities on their own.
Deepa, we could keep on going because you are such an engaging guest and your topic is so important, but we have a time limit. So, as viewers of the show know that I always ask every guest a story of grace. Do you have one that you'd like to share with us? So.
Yeah, I think my story of grace is I ended up getting pretty sick. My own exploration into this topic of, wellness and women of color and being in structures came as a result of getting really ill and having a lot of those mysterious, symptoms that I talked about earlier. And I ended up in bed for almost 8 months. And that process really required me, I think, to have grace and have faith and, really trust the universe in a very different way than I probably would have before. I think what it taught me is that health and success are very tied together, and that you can't have success success without health, which was not something I think I believed before.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Well, what a wonderful story. And I like how your moment of adversity that laid you flat on your back, I'm going to guess, you turned that into a moment of grace. And part of that is the result of this, or the result is this wonderful book, The First, The Few, and The Only. Deepa, how can people find you?
Yes, so the best way is probably my website. So Deepa Puru, DeepaPuru.com, and everything about the book and nFormation and everything else that we are doing is all there.
Great. Deepa Purushothaman, you have been a wonderful guest. And with that, we're going to close out. So thank you.
Thank you.